First, I would like to thank Said Hoja for the invitation, for everyone who is here and participating. This is probably the only group of people in which I could present this who has any interest in the topic. I have found myself incredibly siloed, and what I'm going to speak on is going to already be familiar to you because of Dilek's wonderful presentation. I would like you to consider this just a tiny footnote to the larger project that Dilek is working on. Because had I known of her research prior to starting my own, I would have chosen a different topic because she has handled it so masterfully. So what I'm going to speak to you today about is a slightly later version of the same question and focus more on the institutional space. I am very much an interloper here. I am neither a sociologist nor a philosopher. I am a historian of religion who's interested in sociology and philosophy. So I am here to learn from you to think through some of these larger questions. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity. So I want to begin, and this might be the same photo that you used. We will have some reproduction of photos, so I just to point that out now. But I want to begin with the problem that haunted early 20th century from Paris to Istanbul. That is, how to imagine the role of religion in making of a modern society. In the waning years of empire and the turbulent birth of the Republic of Turkey, a cluster of Darülfünun, soon to be Istanbul University intellectuals, most centrally Mustafa Şekip Tunç, as you have already learned about, and another individual who I will introduce, Mehmet Emin Erşegil, treated that problem not as a yes or no referendum on tradition, but as a practical and conceptual question. What forms of moral life and collective cohesion can modern institutions cultivate? And what languages, philosophical and sociological, let us think those forms at all? My claim today, let's see if this works, picture of the Darülfünun. My claim today is that these thinkers crafted a distinct, semi-idealist, also materialist Bergsonian modernism, used with the Durkheimian sociology of religion to defend religion as both a creative moral energy and a necessary social institution. Again, social institution comes from their words, not mine. Rather than seeing religion as a residual metaphysics to be overcome, they reframed it as a total social force, intuitive, vital, institutional, and instructive. That could be translated into the modern university's conceptual grammar that was being worked out and established at that very moment. That translation was not merely linguistic. As I argue in my dissertation, hopefully soon monograph, hopefully yours comes out first, please. Social science formed the discursive space into which the Islamic tradition was translated via the adoption and adaptation of social scientific language and concepts, and their attending grammars. Even as the experiment provoked critics on both sides and was fundamentally stalled and reconfigured in 1933 with the closure of the first modern university, the Darülfünun, and the opening of Istanbul University. The rest of my talk proceeds in 5 moves. First, I sketch the Ottoman Turkish problem space that made Bergson and Durkheim compelling. Second, I show how conceptual translation became a method for recoding Islamic sciences within a modern disciplinary order. Third, I turn to Tunç and Erşegil to illustrate how Bergsonian language of intuition and Dure intertwined with the Durkheimian language of social facts and institutions, something that we have all kind of been introduced to in great detail already. Fourth, I trace, and this is all very briefly, the institutional arc of the Darülfünun Faculty of Theology, as Dilek mentioned about the Faculty of Letters being one of the central institutional locations in which many of these discussions take place. I will turn to the Faculty of Theology, which in many ways are kind of outgrowth of the Department of Letters, and since that many of the same faculty members found themselves writing in both journals and working in both institutional spaces. So I will trace that institutional arc, its hopes, conflicts, reformist afterlives to foreground how university reforms reshape that intellectual field. Finally, I end with the stakes. What does the Turkish case or Ottoman case contributes to a global Bergsonism and to our theories of secularization, not as mere decline, but as replacement and rearticulation? So I'm going to start with a discussion of the problem space that Bergson and Durkheim entered into. And I'm borrowing this from the anthropologist David Scott. So I'm looking through this through anthropological frameworks that I have found helpful for doing history of Islamic thought. So by the 1910s and 1920s, Bergson's philosophy circulated widely across the Ottoman and post-Ottoman worlds, offering a language for thinking change, time, and moral creativity against mechanistic determinisms. I will put a caveat here and say not just an antagonism or opposition, but as an internal discursive discussion about the place of materialism in institutional spaces of the Dar al-Fanoon. So what mattered was not simply the importation of European ideas, which have typically been the framework in which historians of this period have discussed these movements, but the fit between these ideas and a historically specific problem space. Following the work of David Scott, as I mentioned, a problem space is, and I quote, demarcates a discursive context, an ensemble of questions and answers around which a horizon of identifiable stakes hang, with conjecture naming the contingent reorganization of those questions in time. In a way, he's bringing the late Stuart Hall's notion of conjecture that depicts there into an anthropological space to think about what makes something a problem that requires an answer. And so while Dilek framed this answer, this Bergsonian moment, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the problem that some intellectuals in the Faculty of Theology sought to address. So early Republican intellectuals perceived themselves to be living through a moment when everything was put into question at once, in the words of Ismail Haqqi Baltajoğlu. Political sovereignty, moral education, scientific authority, and the place of Islam. Their wager was that modern social sciences and vitalist philosophy could be adapted to speak in a unified language about these entangled concerns. To approach the problem in Bergsonian terms, adaptation could be conceived not as a passive mimicry of Western forms, but rather as a conscious development of a solution to a problem, a creative replying rather than a mere repeating. Two implications followed. First, secularization should not be conflated with the simple attenuation of religion. Secularization led to the new permanent placement of religion in conceptual, a new placement of religion in conceptual, institutional, and social life, rather than its disappearance. Here I'm speaking kind of contra to the historiography of the Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic that takes a very strong focus on the Kemalist development and rewriting of that early period of the 1910s to the 1930s, in which there was quite a robust debate, as Dilek pointed to at the beginning, between what will later cement as Kemalism and the nascent articulations of secularization that were drawn on but ultimately did not win out. Second, the central arena for this replacement in Turkey was the modern university, where the languages of sociology, psychology, and philosophy of religion could legitimize a new way of thinking religious life. Here, emphasis on thinking religious life. And I can explain more what I mean by that later. So I want to turn to conceptual translation. The crucial pivot of the 1920s was not only translating European text into Ottoman Turkish, it was translating Ottoman Islamic sciences into modern disciplinary forms. The latter move to translate Ottoman Islamic sciences into social sciences is frequently unacknowledged. But for Dar al-Fanoon modernists in the theology faculty, or the faculty of Ilahiyat, the dissolution of Ottoman institutions like the Madrasa meant that its modes of scholarly production also needed to be reconstituted in new disciplines. This program was explicitly outlined in the 1928 Declaration of Religious Reform, Dini Islahat Beyan Namesi, which was published in a couple of newspapers, which I'll show you. Actually, here you can see this is a discussion about this Declaration of Religious Reform, and you can see the bottom circle there. That photo is of Mustafa Shakib Tunç, and above him is Fuat Koperlu, two very important figures in the Dar al-Fanoon at that time. This is quite a critical take on this declaration, which I will discuss in just a second. So the program was explicitly outlined in this Declaration of Religious Reform, which proposed replacing the Islamic sciences of Kalam, or a kind of metaphysical theology, and Tasawwuf, which is often known as Sufism, with a new philosophy of religion and literature, interestingly enough. This was part of a broader recognition that translation was conceptual as well as linguistic. Thinking philosophy through an Arabic Islamic vocabulary afforded different possibilities than thinking through a modified, modernized, newly created, quote unquote, pure Turkish vocabulary. It was at the Dar al-Fanoon and the intellectual bureaucratic spaces adjacent to it that these issues were worked out. Their locus of enunciation was absolutely central to the solutions that they provided. The result is what I call a university-based, quote unquote, secular theology. And this is very much something I'm trying to find a language for because, as Nick pointed out, these individuals are very much in the center, in the middle of many different kind of discursive arguments that are taking place. A tradition that sought to render Islamic concepts commensurable with social scientific analysis, something that seems maybe obvious, but in fact wasn't obvious at all, giving rise to a distinctive Republican university theology explicitly contrasted with the Madrasa theology. Bergsonism and Durkheimian thought supplied the scaffolding for this commensurability. Bergson for life, intuition, and moral creativity, Durkheim for institutions, social facts, and moral education. So the intellectual field, the significance of Bergsonism among competing discourses. Why did Bergson loom so large? Partly because Bergsonism offered a grammar to resist both the cruder positivisms and the nostalgic return to scholasticism, a term that is used in translation as scholastique in the period, which I think I haven't found, and if anyone has an idea of where to find a study of how scholasticism becomes the way in which you distance yourself from your opponents, I think is a kind of discursive move that we need to consider its origins and what it makes possible, what it doesn't make possible, what it forecloses. The work of, oh, the screen just moved, okay. The work of Durkheim and Bergson provided especially powerful concepts upon which a defense of religion as a social institution and creative energetic force of social life, Ijtimai Hayat, Hayat Ijtimaiya, could be expressed against the reigning dogmas in some circles of positivism and the fear of Madrasa theology as a continuation of such scholasticism. And partly because Turkish modernists read themselves into broader European debates about society as sacred. Here I'm drawing on the work of Michael Behrendt's History of French Social Republicanism, who has argued that for many French intellectuals, and I will leave it to French intellectuals here to tell me if this is right or wrong, to believe in religion was, in a way, to believe in society. To think through those two terms together, they had mutual implications. And the Dar al-Fanoon scholars echoed the core move. Turkish Republican modernists, as Said was mentioning earlier, saw religion as an epiphenomenon of society, equally important, natural, and valuable for establishing social cohesion, not something that could simply be dispensed with as an ideological concern. Bergson also mattered because his philosophy gave the scholars a conceptual image of adaptation that validated translation as creative problem solving. The second image provided by Bergson is the image of adaptation as a conscious development of a solution to a problem, a framing I explicitly deploy here to explain the development of social science as a grammar through which there was a creation of secular theology in early 20th century Turkey. In short, Bergsonism in Turkey did not merely baptize, forgive the awful pun, religion with the waters of intuition. It helped authorize a new intellectual posture, that modern, vital, national moral life could be cultivated through institutions while refusing a kind of crude materialist reduction and a clerical retrenchment of what preceded it. So here you can see a quote from a book called Religion and Life, Din ve Hayat, that was published by Ismail Hakkı Baltacıoğlu, who was at one point the rector of the Dar al-Fanoon, who says, and I can't see here because, let's see if I can move this. He says, sociology is the science that can provide us judgments supported by analysis and comparison about truth and error, life, development, and the source of social existence of this thing we call religion. Thus, the problem of religion, the thing that I'm trying to excavate here, what is this problem, is not something altogether different from social problems that require the use of scientific methods. So when we study the crisis from this point of view, we see that we are faced with a number of affairs. And speaking about religion, there are accepted truths that authoritative interpreters acquire through intuition, and that sociologists know via empirical methods, kind of bringing together of two different sociological traditions to rethink this new problem of religion. So I'm going to turn now to the Dar al-Fanoon as that institutional crucible and why its reform mattered to this larger project. To see the stakes, we need the institutional story. The Dar al-Fanoon's history is, I'm hoping to claim, the history of Ottoman and Turkish modernization efforts in some important ways. From Tanzimat roots, and I'm going to gloss over a very complex period here, so forgive me, from Tanzimat roots, reform roots in the 1850s, to the 20th century reconfiguration, reforms oscillated between professional training, kind of French emphasis, and research teaching integration, a more German model that Said referred to earlier, shaping how religious knowledge would be taught and to what end. This is really a critical question about if you're going to reform the institutions of the late Ottoman period, notably the madrasas, what is their aim? What is their goal? To what kind of scholar are they supposed to produce? And why could you not do this in an institutional setting like a university instead of a separate setting like a madrasa? Many parts of this quote unquote Muslim world have this kind of separated identity in which you can go to Egypt today and you can see Al-Azhar as an institutional space that takes its origins from the madrasa curriculum, which has also heavily integrated social sciences into its approach. And then you can look at the secular state university system. But in the Ottoman Empire, that didn't end up being the route that was taken. What was taken was a route of consolidation, which is why now you can go to any theology department in the Republic or in Turkey today, and you can find a sociology of religion department, which is separate from the sociology department that is teaching relatively similar curriculum. So I think this is an interesting question: is how do we get there? What are its kind of earlier moments of expression? So the pedagogical educational commitments of the late Ottoman higher learning were rooted in a central assumption geared towards the production and cultivation of specialists, professionals, specifically religious functionaries. The Department of High Religious Sciences, which was created in 1900, a kind of predecessor to the 1924 Faculty of Theology, offered courses in tafsir, or Quranic interpretation, hadith, or studying the teachings and speech of the Prophet Muhammad, fiqh, or kind of what we gloss as Islamic law, which is problematic, kalam, kind of metaphysical theology or philosophy, and Islamic history. After 1913, the curriculum expanded to include topics like ethics of the Sharia and Sufism, philosophy and its history, Arab philosophy, and the history of religions, things that prior to these 1913 forms weren't being taught in the curriculum of the Dar al-Funun and its predecessors, thus historicizing the Islamic disciplines and thereby aligning them or setting the ground for aligning them with different scholarly methods and new emergent scholarly models. The political educational conjuncture intensified after 1908 and through the war years. The assumption that the conditions of modern life, and this is something I really appreciate about Frederick's introduction, is that these conditions of modern life, the questions that people were seeking answers to, were in an important way now global. They weren't fragmented according to one's particular location geographically, even though the experience of that fragmentation would differ widely between France and India or between North Africa and Britain. But the questions and thus the answers might indeed be shared. So that national survival required specifically new institutional solutions, and that the university was a key site of creating and establishing those solutions. Debates about, and my computer jumped again, hold on one second. Debates over sending students to Europe, importing foreign professors, equal pay for local versus foreigners was fierce. These were happening in many different locations, published journals, newspaper articles, conference proceedings, and congressional or parliamentary discussions. As Halide Adib recalls, foreign scholars sometimes earned as much as 5 times local salaries of their counterparts. In 1928, Mehmed Amin Ershagil, writing in Hayat, a journal life that he established and was the editor of for a long time, criticized proposals to shutter the university and outsource education abroad. One option was you could send those to other institutions that have already been established. Before countering it with a slower temporality of reform, Mehmed Amin Ershagil says, quote, "However, we cannot create scientific life or scientific community in the country the moment we want it. But we can take measures starting now to procure the future of these institutions. Like Bergson's image of duration as sugar dissolving in tea, and out to one for us today in Turkey, the diffusion of new concepts and images require their own duration. They can't instantaneously be created. They require maybe a some kind of antagonism or some kind of dialectical relationship between production and creation, as we learned earlier this morning. So against that backdrop, the Faculty of Theology, Lahiyat Faculty, from 1924 to 1933, became a charged experiment in translating religion into a grammar of social science, a kind of Turkish religion Wissenschaft. The curricular and institutional design did not aim to restore the Medresa, it aimed to manage a modern social transformation by reframing the Islamic discursive tradition through sociology, psychology, literature, and philosophy of religion. The intellectual mix is captured by staffing, alongside more traditionally trained scholars like Mehmet Sharifuddin Yalkaya, Ismail Haqqa, who Said Hoja has written extensively about. One of the only foreign scholars teaching at the Faculty of Theology at that time, from 1926 to 1931, was the famed historian of religion and mythology, George Dumazil. Yet the experiment was short-lived. The modernist tradition of Ilahiyat was thus either too secular for those who sought a more rooted reformation, or not quite secular enough for those who wanted a complete divorce from the past as an inauthentic imitation of Arabs and Persians. And this language is quite explicit in some of the more radical, we could say, proto or pseudo-Kemalist iterations, the Journal Cadre that was mentioned earlier, in which there was a wish for a hard break. But as we learned from Bergson, there are no such things. It's not so easy. And in 1933, it was terminated as the Dar al-Funun was closed and reopened under the control of a nascent Kemalist single-party regime. The closure did not end the story, it reframed it. In the 1949 parliamentary debates over re-establishing a theology faculty, this time not at Istanbul University, but at Ankara University, the Minister of Education at the time, Tahsin Banoğlu, said, quote, "The subjects that will be studied in this faculty will be religious in majority, like exegesis, prophetic tradition, jurisprudence. Theology is by itself an autonomous discipline." It's a very distinct way of framing the question that you would not have seen in earlier iterations. The essential core here will be the religious sciences. Ismail Haqqı Baltacıoğlu, the one-time rector of the Dar al-Funun and public intellectual who had been absolutely essential to the earlier sociological trajectory of the first Faculty of Theology, then offered a remarkable confession about this earlier iteration. He says, and I quote, "Is in that the Faculty of Theology in Istanbul, I also had some responsibility. In one sense, we realized that it was actually a kind of faculty of sociology. But here in Ankara, the Islamic sciences will be essential, and the sociological sciences will be secondary. Without religious education, human personality cannot be complete." End quote. So as I observe in the larger dissertation from which I'm kind of pulling bits and pieces here, Baltacıoğlu confessed to what many had already suspected. The Dar al-Funun's experiment in theology was a strategy to translate religion into the secular disciplines of the social sciences, an attempt to make two traditions of theoretical as well as practical inquiry commensurate. The twist is that even as Ankara's faculty promised to center the Islamic disciplines and Islamic sciences, the hegemonic framework of social science was now an ineradicable component of university theology everywhere. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to jump here again to show you a picture of Mustafa Şekip Tunç. I'm going to show you a picture of the very same piece that Dilek showed, which kind of is a gloss and a translation and his own kind of interpretation all at the same time. It's kind of hard to discern that when you first read. You're wondering, are you reading a report? Are you reading, a discussion of Bergson, or are you reading a translation, which was, as Dick pointed out, common in the area. Mustafa Şekip Tunç writes this in 1923, in which he is periodizing the significance of Bergson as well for the kinds of questions. He talks a lot about, at the very beginning, the fact that he was incredibly depressed prior to, or right after the end of the First World War, and he needed an intellectual light to guide him out of that. The old voices no longer provided that inspiration, and in Bergson, he found a new language to articulate the questions he was seeking to answer.
He died in 1958.
1958, yeah, that is actually, so I took the picture from another thing. So it's actually, those are the dates of Ismail Haqqı Baltacıoğlu's life. Yeah. So those are the wrong dates. I apologize for that. So let me just jump here to thinking through some of Mustafa Keeptunch's contributions. I want to look at a later piece that he wrote, which is somewhat of a collection of reflections on philosophy of religion that was published in 1958 under the direction of his wife after he had passed away. In this preface, which is called Towards the Philosophy of Religion, he says explicitly, quote, in the same way that philosophy has developed a necessary critical sensibility for the sciences, so philosophy of religion will ground our understanding of religious feeling and religious life in a detailed and conscious manner. In conclusion, let me state, there is no ideology whatsoever that can destroy religion. Again, I think this is taking aim at this Kemalist emergence of an explicit Leitlich or secularism that sees no place for religion institutionally and has to be reduced to a kind of individualized participation. But as we've talked about earlier, the Bergsonian inspired intellectuals in this moment wanted to see religion as a much more fluid and much more institutionally necessary discourse for the development of a modern Turkey, of a republican Turkey, of a secularized Turkey that wasn't secularist and approach. So let me, running low on time, and move on to Mehmet Emin really quick. So Mehmet Emin Ereshkigal, also a Bergsonian-inspired intellectual, but wrote quite extensively in the field of education and pedagogy. And here's a journal which he was quite frequently an author in called Mihrab, in which he spoke quite exhaustively about the creation of theology as a new discipline, as a new object of social scientific study. So he, in 1928, he pushed back against a quick fix fantasies of institutional reform, warning that universities could not be rebuilt overnight by outsourcing training to Europe. As he put it, and I quote, "We cannot create scientific life and scientific community the moment we want it." The temporality, a non-revolutionary reformist time of institution building, aligned with the broader Dar al-Funun compromise to make religious knowledge as a modern social science without abolishing its moral weight. It is in this sense that the theology faculty in the 1920s functioned as a third way between aggressive positivism and an anti-modern retrenchment through the development of theology, university theology. So I'm going to just list out some of these very briefly, some bullet points on how reforms of the Dar al-Funun reshape this intellectual landscape. So first and most importantly, it repositioned religion as an object of knowledge, something in which one studies as something called deen, as something called religion, not something one engages in as a commitment to a certain kind of life, to a certain kind of habit, to a certain kind of tradition. It embedded translation into institutional routines. This is, in a sense, creating and normalizing new conceptual schemas to develop curricula, creating new fields in which one would investigate religion. It shapes a kind of sociology of knowledge, as we talked about. And its afterlives in the Ankara University Faculty of Theology and in the late 80s explosion of theology faculties across Turkey, and in the 90s and 2000s. I mean, we're talking about going from a handful of theology faculties until the 1970s, 80s to having, I believe, over 120 theology faculties in universities in Turkey. And what's interesting is when I brought this to the head of one of the theology faculties, I won't name that institution, and said, you know, what do you think of these individuals who are writing at this time? Do you find useful their ideas for reconsidering what happened in the Turkish Republic to religious institutions? He was like, why are you kind of rummaging through the recycling bin of intellectual history for these guys? Like, we all read them, but no one reads them anymore seriously. He says this as I look up and the name of one of these individuals is plastered on the wall. It is the honorary auditorium or salon named after these individuals. So the institutional legacy outlasts the way in which maybe Islamic sciences or theology has continued and develops today. So let me conclude by saying I wanted to kind of frame this distinction between total social fact and social institution. That between is where Bergson and Durkheim met in the early Republic of Istanbul. It is also where Turkish intellectuals use their language to argue for a modern vital religion, creative, intuitive, but also institutional and pedagogical. The Darul experiment made that argument legible, contested, and finally marginalizable in the single-party state. But marginalization is not erasure. When almost 20 years later, Ankara University revived divinity, this time in 1949, debates made public what the earlier experiment had made possible. A secularism that could authorize a form of religious education precisely because the object religion had been reconceptualized and relocated. This form of Bergsonian secularism, we would grant that, which fell quickly out of favor, articulated a view that political secularism was not the enemy of religious belief as long as the latter did not exert itself over the ostensibly rational procedures of the former. One last reflection. My point is not that Bergson influenced Turkey in a straightforward way. I want to sidestep that anxiety of influence question that's often prominent in the history of thought or intellectual history, as it's not my question at all. Instead, I want to say that in some significant way, the conditions of modern life are now global. The problem space shared, and translation was one appropriate response, a conscious development of a solution to by which local actors remade the very grammar of religion. If global Bergsonism is to be more than a geography of readers, it must be a history of such translations, of the institutions, curricula, and authors who make more life thinkable anew. Thank you for bearing with me.
You had a very inspiring talk and showing the links between university reform and this renewal of the language, this appropriation and re-elaboration of philosophical concepts as in very interesting. We have 15 minutes for questions.
I have too much for today, but again, thank you very much, Micah, for this excellent presentation and for the way also you are just problematizing the question of religion being an object for sciences, social sciences. And this is very interesting because if we trace back to the emerging of history of religions in the Ottoman Empire, Tarihi Ediyan, it's very interesting to see the way it is then linked also to oneself, to the way intellectuals are considering themselves Muslims and so on. So Islam was out of the topic of history of religion. Tarihi Ediyan would not really put Islam inside. After that, the Tasavvuf Tarihi of Mehmet who wrote also a book on the Darul Tarihi.
Right, yeah.
And in the Tasavvuf Tarihi, Mehmet did really something very dual. All the religions in one side and Islam in the other side. So we have a sort of, we can trace the way religion is being objectified and then put again as one's religion inside the sciences. And we have also after that philosophy of religion, psychology of religion, represented as the sociology of religion, as we told. It's very, very interesting. But also religious anthropology, with a text from Hughes, which is not very well known, and which is called Marazi Ruhiyat, Psychopathology, 1924. He was then very young, Hughes, and it was a sort of text with observations on cultural ethnology of anatomy, Anatolian culture. And he then worked on Charles Blondel and his quantitative psychology. But the main point was, and also the most anthropology, religious anthropology, the main point was that the religion was at the core of the psychogenetics. Religious feeling is at the basis of the individual psyche. This is interesting to see that at the very beginning of the 20s, by a very young intellectual moment, they had also they were constructing also the concept of religion as an object of science, but also as the source of this science. Yeah. And I think this is the same thing as you said, the psychology and the philosophy of religion. Just one thing, it's the term of ahlak that I find very interesting, transitive to deen. As you said, secularization is just a displacement, which is a very interesting definition of what is secularization. Yeah. And if we have a look at the religious politics in school of the Kemalist regime, we can think that, yes, religion is totally put out of the picture. The Faculty of Theology is closed in 1933. The Imam Ratib schools are closed, and so on and so on. But it's not that simple. Yeah. And if we look at it, we can see really that only families who are not sending again their children at the Faculty of Theology or at the Imam schools, because they were thinking about other possibilities, professional. And so really, thank you very much, because it's very comprehensive reflection on what is religion as an object, as a social fact, and as at the core of the social science. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, all of those were incredibly significant. I mean, this question of akhlaq or ethics, almost all of the authors wrote something on that, and Nazir Ogari especially, for a long time. And then also the later development of these individuals' thought after the 1930s, once secularism concretizes in a new institutional political space, the Constitution, these intellectuals develop. They never quite distance themselves entirely from the work they've done before, but they take it in different directions. Like what becomes speakable changes, I think, in that space. The 1920s, I would argue, Kemalism and republicanism even had a space for a kind of republican theory of religion that then is no longer possible by the 40s and 50s in that same vein. And that this is very much an Istanbul Ankara story. This is not talking at all about the Eastern provinces or the ways in which certain theological disciplines continued either underground or in Kurdish medreses, or people who were sent abroad to get education and then came back. I mean, many of the prominent intellectuals of the, let's say, 1940s, 50s, 60s, people like Nurettin Topçu, for example, who wrote quite a lot about Bergson in some way and ethics, and used the new language of tazkiyah over hadith or zihin instead of some of the kind of late Ottoman traditions. And I'm interested to see how you theorize that. But these individuals had sheikhs, had teachers, many of which were from the Balkans or from Kurdish regions, who had another way of kind of accessing certain religious traditions, which I haven't talked about here at all. So I don't want to paint this as the only way in which people connected intellectually. But this is institutionalized spaces, I think, deserve a rethinking because they have been quite misunderstood, I would argue, from the kind of history of political secularism that has dominated Turkish studies of the 20th century.
We have another question. Thank you. Yeah, I learned a lot actually. I was just wondering, out of curiosity and remembering what Frederick Holmes said this morning about the influence of the last book of Bergson, and it seems like from both of your talk, the concept of immortality or spirituality and the philosophy of biology present in Bergson, but also the philosophy of duration was quite influencing the Turkish exchanges and the reception of Bergson. But it seems that it also grew up in a political and religious environment mainly. But I was wondering, except if I missed something, what kind of influence, and if there was one, had the last book he wrote on society and religion?
Yeah. the last book I want to say was published in 1931 or 1932. The translation or serialized translation of sections of the book and then the complete book came out in 1933 or 34.
Very close.
Very close. The first translation in English didn't come out until early 1970s, the University of Notre Dame Press. I use this as just an anecdotal illustration of how close people were following these kind of intellectual spaces. You know, even though Bergson was very popular in the American context, you know, of the early 19 teens and 20s, alongside William James, but you know, by 30 years, it was translated earlier. I haven't yet encountered intense engagement with the work. I don't know if you have, and yeah.
I think this had a huge impact, a huge impact. And even some of the writings of Mustafa Tunç, even in that year, were sort of these anticipations, even of Bergsonian words in the Ressources, the La Morale et la Religion. And I shall maybe work on this thoroughly, but it had an immediate resonance on Turkish Bergsonians, which of course tends to accredit the idea that the question of religion is very central to that.
Actually, Mustafa Şekil's last book, towards the philosophy of religion, that is a reinterpretation of two sources.
Absolutely.
The last chapter is reflection on the two sources.
You're right.
But in terms of its institutional dissemination, I don't know, but I mean, Tunç
In university courses.
in university courses,
And also in many articles, journals,
Yeah.
or many cultural journals, very important. I don't talk about the journals out of the university,
yeah,
but really cultural journals, Yeni Adam and so on.
yes, Bob Joel, yeah. All these kinds of things. There's some kind of blatant, But at the same time, what's interesting here is that we're not talking about necessarily fully published monographs all the time. We're talking about serialized publications work. So like Verga mentioned, Hayat, others with serialized translations. The people were getting this over a period of time, and that journal context, I think, is so absolutely centrally important. Because some of these journals would close down for a few years and then reopen when political circumstances changed.
I mean, Hayat, continuity of the Derga.
Yeah, Hayat is very much, I mean, I think the head kind of note is that quote from Nietzsche about the significance of life, you know. And this is a popular intellectual journal. I mean, think of it as some blog that many people read today kind of thing.
But it's an elite to them. Survive. We cannot talk about something popular. It's a utilitarian phenomenon, but they're also as the elite, the people are themselves, voices more popular voices.
Yeah, with the caveat that there are, you know, discussion about some of the implications of this circulating in newspapers, like this 1928 Declaration of Religious Reform. It's very hard to find actual proof that it was ever taken seriously and institutionalized. There was much gossip about it and all the people who supposedly signed it. And if you read reflections of these same authors later, they said, I never put my name to that document, it was forged, you know. And this document claimed that we are going to put pews in mosques, people can wear shoes, people will play instruments. It's a kind of total reformation of the social aspects, the practical aspects of religious life in Turkey. And people were outraged. They're like, who is this, you know, who are these intellectuals who think that they could come and, you know, but there was no real attention to the fact that there was a lot more taking place behind this kind of gossip about it.
3 or 4 more questions. So yeah, please have a question.
I really like how you framed the issue of problem space. And I just wanted to ask a general question. This morning, you know, Frederick talked about intelligence being a global problem. And has religion become a problem? You know,
If you can answer that, I will give you all my money.
Human being a problem. Human, a problem.
yeah.
But I think we need to be.
But I think that what's interesting about your two these is that they saw resources in Bergson for addressing this, this what they saw as a problem, which was religion. And if we don't just localize it, but we say that okay, like you start off by saying that global conditions have become so they're shared by everybody. So how would these Turkish intellectuals read religion as a problem, as a global problem? So not just something that is weighing on the soul of Anatolia, but something that is, a human issue.
Yeah.
How did they see that? And for which then Bergson becomes a resource. But I'm really interested in that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the question in some senses. How does something not just become a problem, which is interesting, the word mesele in Turkish has that problem, question, ambiguity, but like a problematic issue.
Turkish.
Yeah. So like you have to problematize this dialogue. There's obviously if we wanted to just be historical, I mean, we could do a kind of anecdotal comparison of the way in which institutionalization in other parts of the world are affecting the institutional spaces of the church, for example, and how people are adapting and responding to that. If you wanted to just take that comparative example, then I think it's very obvious why it becomes a global problem, because people are experiencing this as well in the Turkish context with political state institutions. On the other hand, we have to think about this problematization of religion as something that actually precedes the Republic by quite a long time. The problem itself, the problem space changes. The answers that were developed, let's say, in the 1850s to address the problem of the clerical class and or whether or not you can conscript people who are studying in the medicine to fight in the army, right? These are social institutional questions that individuals respond to, and then those answers are somewhat inherited by later intellectuals and then reformed, but the problem spaces themselves change. So the problem space of religion and science, they're in the early 1905 or 6, there was all of these translations of these books on the question of religion and science and whether there is a relationship. Translations coming from both America and Europe. And that framing is different than the 1920s framing of the relationship of life to religion, relationship of religion to social fact, social institution. In a draft that circulated of this Declaration of Religious Reform, they very explicitly say at the beginning, the traditions that we have inherited no longer provide answers to the life that we're now facing. Hence, we need to reestablish or re-engage religion as a social institution, as a total social fact and social institution. So I'm kind of roundabout way saying that we have to ask the question, how does it become a problem, at what time, for whom, when, where, why? Because the problem isn't always the same.
But he's asking to take it to a global issue instead of local Turkish. I mean, how could it be more general for all societies?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at it instead of being a reception, these Turkish intellectuals are just receiving those, right? To say something about a global situation, for which Bergson is an instrument, right? So they are reading into what they think of modernity, about contemporary world or the conditions of the present,
right,
as having a very core essential issue, religion as a problem. So did they ever, through their writings on Bergson, did they ever think about or explain like from where this problem, why this problem becomes such an essential part of a global problem, or is it a global problem?
Well, I think that's the question. Is it a global problem? First of all,
another session. Are there other questions? Quick questions. We will give a break.
Yeah, I have a very quick question. Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to ask, within the political and sociological discussions, did you have a chance to explore the extent in which Ottoman thinkers engaged with the medieval Muslim theologians or philosophers? Like, because there are some discussions about the function of religion and how they can be useful within the society, also both in spiritual and worldly sense. So I wondered whether you encountered something like that.
Yeah, no, I have not dug into that question specifically. What I did look at was the reframing of medieval scholarly traditions in the context of a nationalizing process, in which, for example, if you look at some of the early publications of the Journal of the Faculty of Theology at Dartmouth, you will see there's a whole section on people like Al-Ghazali or Ibn Sina. And it says, the first Turkish philosophers is how it's framed, which is an interesting rereading, right? I mean, what's Turkish about, Ibn Sina or, a number of individuals, some of which might have Turkic origins, but they're not Turkish in a national sense. So I looked at mainly that reception and reframing, re-narrating an Islamic past, an Ottoman Islamic tradition, in a way to preserve it, but also to distinguish what you're doing now from what came before. And I don't want to reduce what they were doing to polemics, but I think there is something to be said for re-narrating. I mean, Toprulu does this quite extensively in his discussions of Sufi, right? He talks about the Tasawwuf as if its contributions were mainly literary, as opposed to the ethical question that people like Mehmet Ali Aini were very specifically concerned with. So if you re-narrate Sufism as a predominantly literary process, then you're now able to read traditions of the Tasawwuf in a secular context as literary contributions to the Turkish canon, right? So that's the way I approached it. I think there's an excellent question to be explored there about, was there an attempt to reread this, or was there simply an attempt to distance oneself from those traditions as scholasticism, which I think is an interesting point.
Thank you very much.